The moment someone tells you that you are not allowed to see your own birthday cake, you should probably start asking questions. My name is Patricia Morgan, and when this story began, I was about to turn 69 years old. If you had asked me then what I wanted for my birthday, my answer would have been simple. I wanted dinner with my family, a small cake, and a peaceful evening together. After all, at my age, the celebrations themselves matter less than the people sitting around the table. For most of my life, birthdays had never been about gifts or attention. They were about connection. They were about seeing children, grandchildren, and relatives gathered in one place. That year, however, my birthday somehow stopped belonging to me long before the candles were ever lit. It started when my daughter-in-law Nicole volunteered to organize everything. At first, I was grateful. Nicole was 38, energetic, and loved planning events. When she called me 3 weeks before my birthday and announced that she wanted to handle the celebration, I thanked her warmly. She sounded excited and assured me that I would not need to worry about a single detail. Looking back, I should have noticed how quickly the plan stopped reflecting anything I actually wanted. I had suggested a small dinner at a local restaurant I loved. Nicole immediately dismissed the idea and explained that everyone would enjoy a gathering at Ethan and her house much more. I mentioned my favorite foods. She told me she had already chosen a menu. I suggested inviting a few longtime friends from church. She said the guest list was already nearly complete. None of these moments seemed serious on their own. Every time I raised a concern, Nicole smiled and reminded me that she was trying to make the day special. So I stayed quiet. It felt easier than arguing over something as simple as a birthday party. My son Ethan seemed happy that someone else was handling the planning. Whenever I mentioned small concerns, he reassured me that Nicole was only trying to be thoughtful. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part felt strangely disconnected from an event that was supposedly celebrating me. The weeks passed quickly. Decorations were ordered. Invitations were sent. Family members called to say they were looking forward to attending. Everyone seemed excited except me. The closer the party came, the more I felt like a guest instead of the guest of honor. Then came the first moment that truly made me uncomfortable. About 5 days before the celebration, my granddaughter Olivia stopped by my house after school. While we sat together in the kitchen drinking lemonade, she casually mentioned that Nicole had become unusually secretive about the birthday cake. I laughed and told her surprises were part of the fun. Olivia did not laugh back. Instead, she hesitated before saying something I would remember for a long time. She told me she had accidentally seen a design sketch for the cake and thought it looked strange. When I asked what she meant, she quickly changed the subject. At the time, I assumed she was being dramatic. Teenagers often notice things adults overlook, but they also worry about things that turn out to be harmless. A few days later, I decided to call Nicole and ask a simple question. What kind of cake had she chosen? There was a brief pause on the phone. Then she laughed and told me I would find out at the party. When I pressed for details, her answer became even stranger. Trust me, she said. You are not allowed to see it until everyone else does. Something about the way she said it left me uneasy. And as I hung up the phone that afternoon, I had no idea that the cake waiting at the center of that celebration was about to change the entire evening. The morning of the party arrived with the kind of clear Tennessee weather people hope for when planning outdoor gatherings. Sunlight filled my kitchen while I prepared a small tray of appetizers I insisted on bringing. Even though Nicole repeatedly told me I did not need to contribute anything. Old habits are difficult to break. For most of my life, showing up empty-handed to a family gathering felt wrong. Around noon, Ethan called to confirm the schedule. He sounded cheerful and distracted, mentioning decorations, guests, and last-minute details. When I jokingly asked whether he had at least seen the mysterious birthday cake, he laughed and admitted that Nicole had been keeping it secret from him too. Somehow that answer did not reassure me. If anything, it deepened the strange feeling that had been growing for weeks. By late afternoon, I arrived at their house. The driveway was already crowded with cars. Relatives greeted me warmly as I walked inside. Several cousins, neighbors, and longtime family friends had gathered in the living room and backyard. Everyone seemed genuinely excited to celebrate. For a few minutes, I allowed myself to relax. Maybe I had been overthinking everything. Maybe Nicole's secrecy was simply her way of creating a memorable surprise. Then I started noticing little things. The decorations were beautiful, but they reflected Nicole's tastes far more than mine. The music playing through the speakers was a playlist she loved. The menu featured several dishes she often served at her own events. None of my favorite foods were present. Again, each detail seemed minor by itself. Together, however, they reinforced a growing realization. This party felt carefully designed around the organizer rather than the guest of honor. As people mingled, I found myself answering the same question repeatedly. Guests wanted to know whether I had helped plan the celebration. Each time I smiled and explained that Nicole had handled everything. The reactions were surprisingly similar. Several people looked mildly surprised. One aunt even joked that she could not imagine me giving up control of my own birthday. Neither could I, if I was being completely honest. About an hour later, Olivia found me standing near the back patio. She looked nervous. At first, I assumed she was simply overwhelmed by the number of guests. Then she quietly asked whether I was enjoying myself. The question felt oddly serious coming from a 16-year-old. I told her I was having a lovely time. She nodded but did not seem convinced. Before I could ask what was bothering her, Nicole called her away to help with something inside. As Olivia walked toward the house, she glanced back at me with an expression I could not quite interpret. Concern, worry, maybe both. The evening continued. More guests arrived. Conversations flowed easily, yet the strange undercurrent remained. Every important decision appeared to pass through Nicole. Every announcement came from Nicole. Every detail centered on Nicole's vision for the event. At one point, I overheard a guest thanking her for organizing such a wonderful party. Nicole smiled proudly and responded that making memorable moments required creativity and effort. The comment was harmless enough, but something about the tone bothered me. It sounded less like someone celebrating family and more like someone presenting a performance. As sunset approached, people gradually moved toward the dining area. Tables were arranged beautifully. Candles flickered. The atmosphere felt almost theatrical. Then I noticed a large covered cart being rolled into the room from the kitchen. Conversations immediately quieted. Guests turned their attention toward the center of the space. Nicole's smile widened. Ethan looked curious. Olivia suddenly looked uncomfortable. And for the second time that week, I found myself wishing I had trusted my instincts much earlier. The room fell quiet as the covered cart rolled to the center of the dining area. Guests smiled expectantly. Children leaned forward in their seats. Someone dimmed the lights slightly, creating the warm atmosphere people associate with birthday celebrations. Nicole stepped forward with the confidence of a master of ceremonies preparing for the highlight of the evening. Ethan stood beside her, smiling politely, though he still looked uncertain about whatever surprise was waiting beneath the cover. I remained seated, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had been following me all day. Then Nicole placed both hands on the cloth and announced that she had spent weeks planning something unforgettable. Several guests applauded. Others laughed and encouraged her to reveal the cake. With a dramatic flourish, she pulled away the cover. For a second, nobody said anything. The cake itself was beautiful. 3 tiers, elegant decorations, and intricate frosting work covered every surface. Yet it was not the design that captured everyone's attention. It was the message written across the front. In large decorative lettering, the cake read, "Patricia's retirement from being in charge." A few scattered laughs emerged from different parts of the room. Not loud laughter. More the uncertain reaction people give when they are not sure whether something is meant to be funny. I stared at the words, convinced for a moment that I had misunderstood them. Retirement from being in charge? The phrase made little sense. I had not been in charge of this party. In fact, I had barely been allowed to participate in planning it. Nicole immediately began laughing. "Come on, everybody," she said. "You know Patricia likes running everything." A few guests smiled politely. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Across the room, I noticed Olivia looking down at the floor. Ethan's smile disappeared almost instantly. What surprised me most was not the message itself. It was the realization that Nicole genuinely expected everyone to enjoy it. She seemed completely unaware that many people were not laughing. Instead, they were watching, observing, trying to understand why a birthday cake appeared to be making fun of the person it was supposed to celebrate. I forced a smile because I did not want to create a scene. After all, dozens of people had gathered to enjoy the evening. I refused to let my discomfort ruin it for everyone else. Several relatives approached me and quietly wished me a happy birthday. Their voices carried an unusual gentleness, as though they sensed something was wrong but could not yet identify exactly what it was. Meanwhile, Nicole continued explaining the joke. According to her, the cake represented a new chapter where younger generations could finally take control. She laughed again while describing how difficult it could be when older family members refused to step aside. The comments were delivered casually, wrapped in humor, but each one landed a little harder than the last. The atmosphere in the room began changing. Conversations slowed. Smiles became less natural. People exchanged glances that seemed to ask the same question. Why was this becoming the theme of a birthday celebration? Then something unexpected happened. My cousin Linda quietly leaned toward me and asked whether I had approved the cake beforehand. When I told her I had never seen it until that moment, her expression changed completely. And judging by the reactions appearing around the room, she was not the only person beginning to see the situation very differently. For the remainder of that evening, I did everything possible to preserve the celebration. I smiled for photographs. I thanked guests for coming. I accepted birthday wishes with genuine appreciation because none of this was their fault. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed. The cake was no longer just a cake. It had become a window into how Nicole viewed me. And judging by the reactions around the room, I was not the only person beginning to notice. After the cake was cut and dessert was served, conversations resumed, but the atmosphere never fully recovered. People were polite. They were friendly. Yet there was a carefulness in the room that had not existed earlier. Guests seemed to be paying closer attention to what was being said. Nicole, however, appeared completely unaware of the shift. In fact, she seemed encouraged by the attention. As different groups gathered around tables, she continued making comments about family leadership, independence, and how difficult it could be when older generations refused to let go of control. Each remark was delivered with a laugh. Each remark was framed as a joke. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. At one point, I found myself standing beside my longtime friend Carol, who had known me for nearly 30 years. She quietly asked whether the theme of the cake had been my idea. When I told her it had not, she looked genuinely surprised. "That explains a lot," she said softly. Before I could ask what she meant, another guest joined the conversation and the moment passed. Still, her reaction stayed with me. Throughout the evening, similar exchanges continued. Relatives who normally focused on food, grandchildren, or everyday life kept circling back to the same subject. Had I approved the cake? Had I helped choose the decorations? Had I known about the retirement theme? Every time I answered no, their expressions revealed the same growing confusion. Meanwhile, Olivia became noticeably quieter. She spent most of the evening helping guests, clearing plates, and avoiding the center of attention. Eventually, I found her alone near the back porch. When I asked whether everything was all right, she hesitated before answering. Then she admitted that she had tried to tell Nicole the cake was a bad idea. According to Olivia, several days earlier she had seen the design and suggested that the message might hurt my feelings. Nicole dismissed the concern immediately. She insisted everyone would understand the humor. Hearing that explanation affected me more than I expected. It meant the discomfort in the room had been predictable. Someone had recognized the problem before the party even began. Someone had raised concerns, and those concerns had been ignored. Later that evening, while guests gathered for coffee and conversation, Nicole decided to address the cake again. Standing near the dining table, she joked that perhaps everyone was taking things too seriously. Then she added something that caused several conversations to stop completely. With a smile on her face, she said that every family eventually reaches a point where younger people need to rescue traditions from those who refuse to evolve. The room became unusually quiet. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged her. Yet for the first time all night, almost nobody laughed either. And as I looked around at the faces of relatives, friends, and neighbors, I realized something important. The problem was no longer whether Nicole had embarrassed me. The problem was that she kept revealing more about herself every time she tried to explain the joke. After the last guests left that evening, I drove home with a strange mixture of emotions. Part of me felt embarrassed. Part of me felt disappointed. But more than anything, I felt awake. For months, perhaps even years, I had been explaining away behaviors that deserved closer attention. The birthday party had stripped away many of those excuses. Once I was home, I placed my gifts on the dining room table and sat quietly with a cup of tea. The house felt peaceful compared to the tension I had just left behind. As I replayed the evening in my mind, one detail stood out more than any other. It was not the cake. It was not even the comments. It was the fact that so many people had immediately recognized something was wrong. If the problem existed only in my imagination, the room would have laughed and moved on. Instead, people had become uncomfortable. People had asked questions. People had noticed. That realization stayed with me throughout the following week. Then the phone calls began. The first came from my cousin Linda. She called under the pretense of checking whether I had enjoyed my birthday, but after a few minutes she admitted what she really wanted to discuss. She told me she had been shocked by the cake and even more surprised by Nicole's repeated attempts to explain it. According to Linda, the more Nicole talked, the less humorous the situation appeared. 2 days later, Carol called. Her observations were remarkably similar. She explained that she had initially assumed the cake reflected some private joke I shared with the family. Once she learned that I had never approved the idea, her entire perspective changed. What surprised me was how many people had reached the same conclusion independently. Nobody was coordinating opinions. Nobody was creating drama. They were simply responding to what they had witnessed. As those conversations accumulated, a larger picture began to emerge. Several relatives shared stories about smaller incidents they had previously dismissed. A comment here, an assumption there. Little moments where Nicole seemed unusually determined to position herself as the authority in family matters. None of the stories sounded significant by themselves. Together, however, they revealed a pattern that felt increasingly familiar. Then came a conversation with Olivia that changed everything. She stopped by my house after school one afternoon carrying a container of leftover cookies from the party. At first we discussed ordinary things. Classes, friends, weekend plans. Eventually the conversation drifted back to the birthday celebration. Olivia hesitated for a long moment before speaking. Then she admitted that the cake had never been intended as a simple joke. According to her, Nicole had spent weeks describing it as the perfect way to send a message. When I asked what message, Olivia looked uncomfortable. Finally, she explained that Nicole frequently complained about older family members having too much influence and believed it was time for a new generation to take over important decisions. Hearing those words, I felt a surprising sense of clarity rather than anger. Suddenly the cake made perfect sense. It had never been about humor. It had been about symbolism. The problem was that Nicole had mistaken influence for control and experience for interference. More importantly, she had assumed everyone else shared her perspective. As Olivia prepared to leave that afternoon, she said something that stayed with me long after the front door closed. I think she expected everyone to agree with her. Looking back, I realized Olivia was probably right, and that misunderstanding was about to create consequences Nicole never anticipated. Over the next several weeks, the effects of the birthday party continued spreading through the family in ways Nicole clearly had not expected. There was no dramatic confrontation. Nobody organized a meeting. Nobody demanded explanations. Instead, people simply began paying closer attention. Once someone recognizes a pattern, every future interaction is filtered through that new understanding. Relatives who had once accepted Nicole's comments as harmless humor now listened more carefully. Friends who had laughed politely at previous remarks started noticing the assumptions hidden beneath them. The change was subtle but undeniable. One Sunday afternoon, our extended family gathered for a casual lunch at my sister's house. Events like this had always been comfortable and predictable. People shared stories, discussed grandchildren, and exchanged updates about work and travel. Normally, Nicole thrived in those environments. She enjoyed being the center of conversations and often positioned herself as the person coordinating family activities. That afternoon, however, something felt different from the moment everyone arrived. Conversations flowed naturally, but they no longer revolved around her. More importantly, people were no longer automatically agreeing with everything she said. At one point, the discussion turned toward holiday planning. Nicole immediately began outlining her ideas for how family traditions should evolve. In the past, most people would have nodded along. This time, several relatives offered different opinions. The disagreement remained polite, yet Nicole seemed visibly surprised that others were not immediately supporting her suggestions. As the conversation continued, she became increasingly determined to defend her position. The more she spoke, the more obvious a recurring theme became. She consistently framed family decisions as obstacles created by older generations rather than opportunities for collaboration. Listening quietly from across the room, I realized something important. Nicole genuinely believed she was advocating for progress. The problem was that she had confused leadership with ownership. She viewed differing opinions as resistance rather than participation. Later that afternoon, another revealing moment occurred. A relative complimented me for maintaining several family traditions that had continued for decades. Before I could respond, Nicole laughed and remarked that some traditions survived mainly because nobody wanted to challenge them. The comment was delivered with the same familiar smile she always used when attempting to disguise criticism as humor. This time, however, nobody laughed. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt significant. Eventually, my brother calmly pointed out that traditions often survive because people value them. The conversation moved on, yet the message had already landed. For perhaps the first time, Nicole found herself in a room where her assumptions were not being reinforced. As the afternoon ended, several family members lingered in small groups, discussing everything from vacations to retirement plans. I noticed people engaging with me differently as well. They asked for my opinions. They listened when I spoke. They included me naturally in conversations without treating me as an obstacle that needed to step aside. The respect felt effortless because it was genuine. Meanwhile, Nicole seemed increasingly frustrated by the subtle shift taking place around her. She had spent years assuming the family shared her perspective. Now she was discovering that many people had simply remained quiet. As I drove home that evening, I found myself thinking about Olivia's observation. Nicole truly had expected everyone to agree with her. The birthday cake had been designed to celebrate that assumption. Instead, it had exposed it. And although she did not realize it yet, the next family gathering would give her one final opportunity to either repair the damage or make it much worse. The next family gathering arrived about a month later during a weekend celebration for my nephew's promotion. The event was held at a community banquet room near downtown Nashville, and nearly everyone from the extended family attended. By then, the atmosphere surrounding Nicole had changed in ways she still seemed unwilling to acknowledge. Nobody was treating her poorly. Nobody was excluding her. The difference was far simpler. People were thinking for themselves instead of automatically accepting her version of every situation. When Ethan and Nicole arrived, several relatives greeted them warmly. The evening began pleasantly enough. Guests shared stories, enjoyed dinner, and celebrated the occasion. For a while, I wondered whether the tension that had followed my birthday might finally be fading. Then Nicole decided to give an impromptu speech. Nobody had asked for one. Nobody expected one. Yet shortly after dessert was served, she stood and tapped a spoon lightly against her glass to gain everyone's attention. Conversations gradually quieted. Smiling confidently, she began talking about family growth, changing traditions, and the importance of allowing new generations to lead. At first, the comments sounded harmless. Many people nodded politely. Then the speech started moving in a familiar direction. Nicole explained that families often struggle because some people refuse to step aside and adapt. She joked that progress becomes impossible when everyone keeps looking backward instead of forward. Several guests exchanged glances. The room remained quiet. Encouraged by the attention, Nicole continued. She spoke about how younger family members frequently inherit responsibility without receiving enough authority. She suggested that outdated expectations sometimes prevent healthy change. The words themselves were carefully chosen, but the target was obvious to everyone present. This time, however, something different happened. Nobody rushed to support her. Nobody laughed. Nobody applauded. Instead, people listened with increasingly thoughtful expressions. The absence of agreement seemed to surprise Nicole. She paused briefly before continuing with even greater determination. Then she made the mistake that changed everything. Smiling confidently, she referenced my birthday celebration and described the cake as an example of harmless humor that certain people had taken far too seriously. The room became noticeably still. Several relatives who had never discussed the incident publicly now heard her framing it once again as everyone else's misunderstanding rather than her own poor judgment. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then my cousin Linda calmly asked a simple question. Had Nicole ever considered that the joke might have been inappropriate because the guest of honor had never approved it? Nicole immediately defended herself. She explained that people were too sensitive. Another relative quietly pointed out that Olivia had apparently expressed concerns beforehand. Nicole dismissed that observation as well. With each response, She seemed less reflective and more defensive. What began as a speech about family leadership was becoming something entirely different. It was becoming a public demonstration of how unwilling she was to consider anyone else's perspective. Ethan looked increasingly uncomfortable. Olivia stared at the table. Around the room, relatives listened without interrupting. The more Nicole tried to justify herself, the more obvious her attitude became. By the time she finished speaking, the problem was no longer the birthday cake. The problem was that she genuinely believed disagreement automatically meant she was being treated unfairly. As silence settled across the room, I realized the speech had accomplished exactly the opposite of what she intended. Instead of restoring her image, it had revealed the pattern more clearly than ever before. After Nicole finished speaking, nobody rushed to fill the silence. That was what made the moment so powerful. People were not angry. They were not hostile. They were simply thinking. For years, Nicole had relied on confidence to carry conversations in the direction she wanted. She was accustomed to people smiling politely and moving on. This time, however, the room seemed unwilling to ignore what had just happened. My nephew eventually thanked everyone for attending and gently redirected attention back to the reason for the gathering. Conversations slowly resumed, but the atmosphere had changed permanently. Groups formed around the room, and while nobody openly criticized Nicole, many people were discussing the same subject. Perspective, respect, family. I remained seated for a while, quietly observing. The remarkable thing was that nobody needed convincing anymore. Nobody needed evidence. Nicole had provided it herself. The birthday cake had raised questions. The speech had answered them. As the evening continued, several relatives approached me individually. Their comments were thoughtful rather than dramatic. One aunt apologized for not speaking up sooner when she first felt uncomfortable at the birthday party. A cousin admitted he had noticed similar patterns for years, but always assumed he was reading too much into them. Another family friend simply told me that kindness should never be treated as a weakness. None of these conversations felt like people taking sides. They felt like people recognizing something they had previously overlooked. Across the room, Nicole appeared increasingly aware that something was different. She continued smiling and engaging with guests, yet the responses she received were no longer automatic. People listened politely, but they were evaluating her words instead of accepting them. For perhaps the first time, she was experiencing what it felt like when a carefully maintained image stopped controlling the narrative. Later that evening, I stepped outside onto the patio for some fresh air. The Nashville skyline glowed softly in the distance, while conversations drifted through the open doors behind me. A few minutes later, Ethan joined me. He stood quietly beside me for a moment before speaking. His expression carried a mixture of disappointment and reflection. He admitted that hearing Nicole defend the birthday cake again had affected him differently this time. He said he finally understood why so many people had reacted the way they did. More importantly, he understood why I had been hurt. I appreciated his honesty. There was no need for blame or arguments. Recognition was enough. Before returning inside, Ethan said something I would remember for a long time. He told me that respect is not measured by who controls a room. It is measured by how people feel after spending time with you. The observation was simple, but it captured everything the family had been struggling to express. When we returned to the banquet room, I noticed that Nicole was sitting quietly at one of the tables. For the first time all evening, she was not speaking. She was listening. Whether she was reflecting on what had happened or simply processing the reactions around her, I could not say. What I did know was that the dynamic had shifted. The silence surrounding her was not cruel. It was honest. People no longer felt obligated to support every assumption she made. They were choosing authenticity over convenience. And as the evening drew to a close, I realized that the most important consequence had already arrived. The family was no longer seeing the situation through Nicole's interpretation. They were seeing it for themselves. Sometimes that kind of clarity changes everything. The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace I had not expected. Not because everything suddenly became perfect, but because the uncertainty was finally gone. For months, perhaps years, I had questioned my own instincts. I had wondered whether I was being overly sensitive. I had wondered whether I was imagining problems that did not truly exist. Now I no longer carried those doubts. The family had seen what I had seen. More importantly, they had reached their own conclusions. Nobody had forced them to. The truth had revealed itself naturally. One afternoon, About 6 weeks after the banquet gathering, Ethan invited me to lunch. We met at a small cafe near the river, one of my favorite places in Nashville. The conversation began casually, but eventually he spoke about everything that had happened over the previous months. He admitted that he had spent too much time assuming everyone understood one another without actually listening. He told me he regretted not paying closer attention when concerns first appeared. What mattered most was not the apology itself. What mattered was the sincerity behind it. For the first time in a long while, I felt fully heard. Around the same time, changes began appearing throughout the family. Gatherings felt more balanced. Decisions involved more voices. Traditions were discussed rather than challenged. The atmosphere became healthier because people were communicating instead of competing. Even Nicole seemed different. She was quieter at first, which many people interpreted as embarrassment. I was not so sure. I think she was finally listening. There is a significant difference between being silenced and becoming reflective. Over time, I noticed small changes in her behavior. She asked more questions. She interrupted less frequently. She became more thoughtful about how her comments affected others. The transformation was not dramatic, and it certainly was not immediate. Real growth rarely is. Yet the effort was visible. One evening, several months after my birthday, the family gathered again for a simple dinner. Nothing elaborate. No speeches. No elaborate decorations. No surprises. Just family sharing a meal together. At one point, Olivia handed me a small box wrapped in blue paper. Inside was a framed photograph taken years earlier during a family reunion. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was together. Looking at that picture, I realized something important. The best moments in a family are never about who controls the room. They are about making people feel valued within it. Later that evening, while helping clear the table, Nicole quietly approached me. She did not deliver a dramatic apology. She did not make excuses either. Instead, she simply acknowledged that she had been so focused on proving a point that she had forgotten what the celebration was supposed to represent. It was a brief conversation, but it was honest. And honesty has a way of accomplishing what arguments never can. As the night came to an end, I sat on the back porch watching the lights glow across the neighborhood. Laughter drifted from inside the house. Family members talked comfortably with one another. The tension that had once dominated every gathering was gone. In its place was something far more valuable. Perspective. Looking back now, I rarely think about the cake itself. The frosting disappeared. The decorations were packed away. The photographs were eventually stored in albums. Yet one thing remained. The lesson. Respect cannot be demanded. It cannot be staged. It cannot be written on a cake or delivered in a speech. It is earned through humility, kindness, and consideration. In the end, my real birthday gift was not a celebration. It was clarity. Because the cake disappeared by the next morning, but the truth stayed on the table.